The views which are put forward in this treatise derive from the doctrines of Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein, which are themselves the logical outcome of the empiricism of Berkeley and David Hume. Like Hume, I divide all genuine propositions into two classes: those which, in his terminology, concern relations of ideas, and those which concern matters of fact. The former class comprises of the a priori propositions of logic and pure mathematics, and these I allow to be necessary and certain only because they are analytic. That is, I maintain that the reason why these propositions cannot be confuted in experience is that they do not make any assertion about the empirical world, but simply record our determination to use symbols in a certain fashion. Propositions concerning empirical matters of fact, on the other hand, I hold to be hypotheses which can be probable but never certain. In giving an account of the method of their validation, I claim also to have explained the nature of truth. To test whether a sentence expresses a genuine empirical hypothesis, I adopt what may be called a modified verification principle, for I require of an empirical hypothesis not indeed that it should be conclusively verifiable, but that some possible sense experience should be relevant to the determination of its truth or falsehood. If a putative proposition fails to satisfy this principle, and it is not a tautology, then I hold that it is metaphysical, and that, being metaphysical, it is neither true nor false, but literally senseless. It will be found that much of what ordinarily passes for philosophy is metaphysical according to this criterion, and in particular that it cannot be significantly asserted that there is a non-empirical world of values, or that men have immortal souls, or that there is a transcendent God. As for the propositions of philosophy themselves, they are held to be linguistically necessary and so analytic. And with regard to the relationship of philosophy and empirical science, it is shown that the philosopher is not in a position to furnish speculative truths, which would, as it were, compete with the hypotheses of science, nor yet to pass a priori judgments upon the validity of scientific theories, but that his function is to clarify the propositions of science by exhibiting their logical relationships and by defining the symbols which occur in them. Consequently, I maintain that there is nothing in the nature of philosophy to warrant the existence of conflicting philosophical schools, and I attempt to substantiate this by providing a definitive solution of the problems which have been the chief sources of controversy between philosophers in the past. The view that philosophizing is an activity of analysis is associated in England with the work of G. E. Moore and his disciples. But while I have learned a great deal from Professor Moore, I have reason to believe that B. Beyond, B. and his followers are not prepared to adopt such a thoroughgoing phenomenalism as I do, and that they take a rather different view of the nature of philosophical analysis. The philosophers with whom I am in the closest agreement are those who compose the Viennese circle under the leadership of Moritz Schlick and are commonly known as logical positivists. And of these I owe most to Rudolf Carnap. Further, I wish to acknowledge my indebtedness to Gilbert Ryle, my original tutor in philosophy, and to Isaiah Berlin, who have discussed with me every point in the argument of this treatise and made many valuable suggestions, although they both disagree with much of what I assert. And I must also express my thanks to GRM Willis for his correction of the proofs. A.J. Ayer, 11, Farber's Place, London, July 1935. 1. The elimination of metaphysics. The traditional disputes of philosophers are, for the most part, as unwarranted as they are unfruitful. The surest way to end them is to establish beyond question what should be the purpose and method of philosophical inquiry. And this is by no means so difficult a task as the history of philosophy would lead one to suppose. For if there are any questions which science leaves it to philosophy to answer, a straightforward process of elimination must lead to their discovery. We may begin by criticizing the metaphysical thesis that philosophy affords us knowledge of a reality transcending the world of science and common sense. Later on, when we come to define metaphysics and account for its existence, we shall find that it is possible to be a metaphysician without believing in a transcendent reality, for we shall see that many metaphysical utterances are due to the commission of logical errors rather than to a conscious desire on the part of their authors to go beyond the limits of experience. But it is convenient for us to take the case of those who believe that it is possible to have knowledge of a transcendent reality as a starting point of our discussion. The arguments which we use to refute them will subsequently be found to apply to the whole of metaphysics. One way of attacking a metaphysician One way of attacking a metaphysician who claimed to have knowledge of a reality which transcended the phenomenal world would be to inquire of him, it would be to inquire from what premises his propositions were deduced. Must he not begin, as other men do, with the evidence of his senses? And if so, what valid process of reasoning can possibly lead him to the conception of a transcendent reality? Surely, from empirical premises, nothing whatsoever concerning the properties or even the existence of anything super empirical can legitimately be inferred. But this objection would be met by a denial on the part of the metaphysician that his assertions were ultimately based on the evidence of his senses. He would say that he was endowed with a faculty of intellectual intuition, which enabled him to know facts that could not be known through sense experience. And even if it could be shown that he was relying on empirical premises and that his venture into non empirical worlds was therefore logically unjustified, it would not follow that the assertions which he made concerning this non empirical world could not be true. For the fact that a conclusion does not follow from its putative premise is not sufficient to show that it is false. Consequently, one cannot overthrow a system of transcendent metaphysics merely by criticizing the way in which it comes into being. What is required is rather a criticism of the nature of the actual statements which comprise it. And this is the line of argument which we shall in fact pursue. We shall maintain that no statement which refers to a reality transcending the limits of all or sense experience can possibly have a literal significance, from which it must follow that the labors of those who have striven to describe such a reality have all been devoted to the production of nonsense. It may be suggested that this is a proposition which has already been proved by Kant. But although Kant also condemned transcendent metaphysics, he did so on different grounds. For he said that the human understanding was so constituted that it lost itself in contradictions when it ventured out beyond the limits of possible experience and attempted to deal with things in themselves. And thus, he made the impossibility of a transcendent metaphysic not as we do, a matter of logic, but a matter of fact. He asserted not that our minds could not conceivably have had the power of penetrating beyond the phenomenal world, but merely that they were, in fact, devoid of it. And this leads the critic to ask how, if it is possible to know only what lies within the bounds of sense experience, the author can be justified in asserting that real things do exist beyond, and how he can tell what are the boundaries beyond which the human understanding may not venture unless he succeeds in passing them himself. As Wittgenstein says, in order to draw a limit to thinking, we should have to think both sides of this limit, a truth to which Bradley gives a special twist in maintaining that the man who is ready to prove that metaphysics is impossible is a brother metaphysician with a rival theory of his own. Whatever force these objections may have against the Kantian doctrine, They have none whatsoever against the thesis that I am about to set forth. I cannot here be said It cannot here be said that the author is himself overstepping the barrier he maintains to be impassable. For the fruitlessness of attempting to transcend the limits of possible sense experience will be deduced not from a psychological hypothesis concerning the actual constitution of the human mind, but from the rule which determines the literal significance of language. Our charge against a metaphysician is not that he attempts to employ the understanding in a field where it cannot profitably venture, but that he produces sentences which fail to conform to the conditions under which alone a sentence can be literally significant. Nor are we ourselves obliged to talk nonsense in order to show that all sentences of a certain type are necessarily devoid of literal significance. We need only to formulate the criterion which enables us to test whether a sentence expresses a genuine proposition about a matter of fact, and then point out that the sentences under consideration fail to satisfy. And this we shall now proceed to do. We shall first of all formulate the criterion in somewhat vague terms, and then give the explanations which are necessary to render it precise. The criterion which we use to test the genuineness of apparent statements of fact is the criterion of verifiability. We say that a sentence is factually significant to any given person if and only if he knows how to verify the proposition which it purports to express. That is, if he knows what observations would lead him, under certain conditions, to accept the proposition as being true or reject it as being false. If, on the other hand, the putative proposition is of such a character that the assumption of its truth or falsehood is consistent with any assumption whatsoever concerning the nature of his future experience, then, as far as he is concerned, it is not, it is, if not a tautology, a mere pseudo proposition. The sentence expressing it may be emotionally significant to him, but it is not literally significant. With regard to questions that the procedure is the same. We inquire in every case what observations will lead us to answer the question, one way or the other. If none can be discovered, we must conclude that the sentence under consideration does not, as far as we are concerned, express a genuine question, however strongly its grammatical appearance may suggest it does. As the adoption of this procedure is an essential factor in the argument of this book, it needs to be examined in detail. In the first place, it is necessary to draw a distinction between practical verifiability and verifiability in principle. Plainly, we all understand, in many cases believe, propositions which we have not in fact taken steps to verify. Many of these are propositions which we could verify if we took enough trouble. But there remain a number of significant propositions concerning matters of fact which we could not verify even if we chose, simply because we lack the practical means of placing ourselves in the situation where the relevant observations could be made. A simple and familiar example of such a proposition is the proposition that there are mountains on the farther side of the moon. No rocket has yet been invented which would enable me to go and look at the further side of the moon so that I am able to decide the matter by actual observation. But I do know what observations would decide it for me. If, as is theoretically conceivable, I were once in a position to make them, and therefore I say that the proposition is verifiable in principle, if not in practice, and is accordingly significant. On the other hand, such a metaphysical pseudo proposition as the absolute enters into, but is itself incapable of evolution and progress, is not even in principle verifiable. For one cannot conceive of an observation which would enable one to determine whether the absolute did or did not enter into evolution and progress. Of course, it is possible that the author of such a remark is using English words in a way in which they are not commonly used by English speaking people, and that he does, in fact, intend to assert something which could be empirically verified. But until he makes us understand how the proposition that he wishes to express would be verified, he fails to communicate anything to us. And if he admits, as I think the author of the remark in question would have admitted, that his words were not intended to either express a tautology or a proposition which was capable, at least in principle, of being verified, then it follows that he has made an utterance which has no literal significance even for himself. A further distinction which we must make is the distinction between the strong and the weak sense of the term verifiable. A proposition is said to be verifiable in the strong sense of the term if and only if its truth could be conclusively established in experience. But it is verifiable in the weak sense if it is possible for experience to render it probable. In which sense we are using the term when we say that a putative proposition is genuine only if it is verifiable. It seems to me that if we adopt conclusive verifiability as our criterion of significance, as some positivists have proposed, our argument will prove too much. Consider, for example, the case of general propositions of law. Such propositions, namely as arsenic is poisonous, all men are mortal, a body tends to expand when it is heated. It is of the very nature of these propositions that their truth cannot be established with certainty by any finite series of observations. But if it is recognized that such general propositions of law are designed to cover an infinite number of cases, then it must be admitted that they cannot, even in principle, be verified conclusively. And then, if we adopt conclusive verifiability as our criterion of significance, we are logically obliged to treat these general propositions of law in the same fashion as we treat the statements of the metaphysician. In the face of this difficulty, some positivists have adopted the heroic course of saying that these general propositions are indeed pieces of nonsense, albeit an essentially important type of nonsense. But here, the introduction of the term important is simply an attempt to hedge. It serves only to mark the author's recognition that their view is somewhat too paradoxical without in any way removing the paradox. Besides, the difficulty is not confined to the case of general propositions of law, though it is there revealed most plainly. It is hardly less obvious in the case of propositions about the remote past, for it must surely be admitted that, however strong the evidence in favor of historical statements may be, their truth can never become more than highly probable. And to maintain that they also constituted an important or unimportant type of nonsense would be unplausible, to say the very least. Indeed, it would be our contention that no proposition, other than a tautology, can possibly be anything more than a probable hypothesis. Oh. And if this is correct, the principle that a sentence can be factually significant only if it expresses what is conclusively verifiable is self stultifying as a criterion of significance, for it leads to the conclusion that it is impossible to make a significant statement of fact at all. Nor can we accept the suggestion that a sentence should be allowed to be factually significant if and only if it expresses something which is definitely confutable by experience. Those who adopt this course assume that, although no finite number of observations is ever sufficient to establish the truth of a hypothesis beyond all possibility of doubt, there are crucial cases in which a single observation or series of observations can definitely confute it. But, as we shall show later on, this assumption is false. A hypothesis cannot be conclusively confuted any more than it can be conclusively verified. For when we take the occurrence of certain observations as proof that a given hypothesis is false, we presuppose the existence of certain conditions. And though in any given case it may be extremely improbable this assumption is false, it is not logically impossible. We shall see that there need be no self-contradiction in holding that some of the relevant circumstances are rather than we have taken them to be, and consequently that the hypothesis has not really broken down. If it is not the case that any hypothesis can be definitely confuted, we cannot hold that the genuineness of a proposition depends on the possibility of its definite confutation. Accordingly, we fall back on the weaker sense of verification. We say that the sentence that must be asked about any putative statement of fact is not would any observations make its truth or falsehood logically certain, but simply would any observations be relevant to the determination of its truth or falsehood. And it is only if a negative answer is given to this second question that we conclude that the statement under consideration is nonsensical. To make our position clearer, we must formulate it in another way. Let us call a proposition which records an actual or possible observation an experiential proposition. Then we may say that it is the mark of a genuine factual proposition, not that it should be equivalent to an experiential proposition or any finite number of existential propositions, but simply that some experiential propositions can be deduced from it in conjunction with certain other premises without being deducible from those other premises alone. This criticism seems liberal enough. In contrast to the principle of conclusive verifiability, it clearly does not deny significance to general propositions or to propositions about the past. Let us see what kinds of assertion it rules out. A good example of the kind of utterance that is condemned by our criterion as being not even false but nonsensical would be the assertion that the world of sense experience was altogether admitted that our senses do sometimes deceive us. We may, as a result of having certain sensations, expect certain other sensations to be obtainable, which are, which are in fact not obtainable. But in all such cases, it is further sense experience that informs us of the mistakes that arise out of sense experience. We say that the senses sometimes deceive us just because the expectations to which our sense experiences give rise do not subsequently experience. That is, we rely on our senses to substantiate or confute the judgments which are based on our sensations. And therefore, the fact that our perceptual judgments are sometimes found to be erroneous has not the slightest tendency to show that the world of sense experience is unreal. And observations or series of observations could have any tendency to show that the world revealed to us by sense experience was unreal. Consequently, anyone who condemns the sensible world as a world of mere appearance as opposed to reality is saying something which, according to our criterion of significance, is literally nonsensical. An example of a controversy which the application of our criterion obliges us to condemn as fictitious is provided by those who dispute concerning the number of substances that there are in the world. For it is admitted both by monists, who maintain that reality is one substance, and by pluralists, who maintain that reality is many, that it is impossible to imagine any empirical situation which would be relevant to the solution of their dispute. But if we are told that no possible observation could give any probability either to the assertion that a reality was one substance or to the assertion that it was many, then we must conclude that neither assertion is significant. We shall see later on that there are genuine logical empirical questions involved in the dispute between monists and pluralism. But the metaphysical question concerning substance is ruled out by a criterion as spurious. A similar treatment must be accorded to the controversy between realists and idealists in its metaphysical aspect. A simple illustration, which I have made use of in a similar argument elsewhere, will help to demonstrate this. Let us suppose that a picture is discovered and the suggestion is made that it was painted by Goya. There is a definite procedure for dealing with such a question. The experts examine the picture to see in what way it resembles the accredited works of Goya and to see if it bears any marks which are characteristic of a forgery. They look up contemporary records for evidence of the existence of such a picture and so on. In the end, they may still disagree, but each one knows what empirical evidence would go to confirm or discredit his opinion. Suppose now that these men have studied philosophy, and some of them proceed to maintain that this picture is a set of ideas in the perceiver's mind or in God's mind, others that it is objectively real. What possible experience could any of them have which would be relevant to the solution of this dispute one way or the other? In the ordinary sense of the word real, in which it is opposed to illusory, the reality of the picture is not in doubt. The disputants have satisfied themselves that the picture is real in this sense by obtaining a correlated series of sensations of sight and sensations of touch. Is there any similar process by which they could discover whether the picture was real in the sense in which the term real is opposed to ideal? Clearly, there is none. But if that is so, the problem is fictitious according to our criteria. This does not mean that the realist idealist controversy may be dismissed without further ado, for it can legitimately be regarded as a dispute concerning the analysis of existential propositions and so as involving a logical problem which, as we shall see, can be definitively solved. What we have just shown, is that the question at issue between idealists and realists becomes fictitious when, as is often the case, it is given a metaphysical interpretation. There is no need for us to give further examples of the operation of our criterion of significance, for our object is merely to show that philosophy, as a genuine branch of knowledge, must be distinguished from metaphysics. We are not now concerned with the historical question about how much of what has traditionally passed for philosophy is actually metaphysical. We shall, however, point out later on that the majority of the great philosophers of the past were not essentially metaphysicians, and thus reassure those who'd otherwise be prevented from adopting their criterion by considerations of piety. As to the validity of the verification principle and the form in which we have stated it, a demonstration will be given in the course of this book, for it will be shown that all propositions which have factual content are empirically hypotheses, and that the function of an empirical hypothesis is to provide a rule for the anticipation of experience. And this means that every empirical hypothesis must be relevant to some actual or possible experience, so that a statement which is not relevant to any experience is not an empirical hypothesis and accordingly has no factual content. This is precisely what the principle of verifiability asserts. It should be mentioned here that the fact that the utterances of the metaphysician are nonsensical does not follow simply from the fact that they are devoid of factual content. It follows from that fact, together with the fact that they are not a priori propositions. It should be mentioned here that the fact that the utterances of the metaphysician are nonsensical does not follow simply from the fact that they are devoid of factual content. It follows from the fact that, together with the fact that they are not a priori propositions. And in assuming that they are not a priori propositions, we are once again anticipating the conclusions of a later chapter in this book, for it will be shown there that a priori propositions, which have always been attractive to philosophers on account of their certainty, owe this certainty to the fact that they are tautologies. We may accordingly define a metaphysical sentence as a sentence which purports to express a genuine proposition but does in fact express neither a tautology nor an empirical hypothesis. And as tautologies and empirical hypotheses form the entire class of significant propositions, we are justified in concluding that all metaphysical assertions are nonsensical. Our next task is to show how they come to be made. The use of the term substance, to which we have already referred, provides us with a good example of the way in which metaphysics mostly comes to be written. It happens to be the case that we cannot, in our language, refer to the sensible properties of a thing without introducing a word or phrase which appears to stand for the thing itself as opposed to anything which may be said about it. And, as a result of this, those who are infected by the primitive superstition that to every name a real entity must correspond assume that it is necessary to distinguish logically between the thing itself and any or all its sensible properties. And so they employ the term substance to refer to the thing itself. But from the fact that we happen to employ a single word to refer to a thing and make that word the grammatical subject of the sentences in which we refer to the thing, the thing, it does not by any means follow that the thing really is, oh my God, this is brilliant. I actually agree, simple entity, that it cannot be defined in terms of the totality of its appearances. Thank you for writing. It is true that in talking of its appearances, we appear to distinguish the thing from the appearances, but that is simply an accident of linguistic usage. Logical analysis shows that what makes these appearances the appearances of the same thing is not their relationship to the entity, to an entity other than themselves, their relationship to one another. The metaphysician fails to see this because he is misled by a superficial grammatical feature of his language. A simpler and cleaner instance of the way in which a consideration of grammar leads to metaphysics is the case of the metaphysical concept of being. The origin of our temptation to raise questions about being, which no conceivable experience could enable us to answer, lies in the fact that, in our language, sentences which express existential propositions and sentences which express attributive propositions may be of the same grammatical form. For instance, the sentences matters exist and matters suffer both consist of a noun followed by an, an intransitive verb, and the fact that they have grammatically the same appearance leads one to assume that they are of the same logical type. It is seen that in the proposition matters suffer, the members of a certain species are credited with a certain attribute, and it is sometimes assumed that the same is true of such a proposition as matters exist. If this were actually the case, it would indeed be as legitimate to speculate about the being of matters as it were to speculate about their suffering. But as Kant pointed out, existence is not an attribute. For when we ascribe an attribute to a thing, we covertly assert that it exists. So that, oh my gosh, so that if existence were itself an attribute, it would follow that all positive existential propositions were tautologies and all negative existential propositions self contradictory. This is not the case, so that those who raise questions about being, which are based on the assumption that existence is an attribute, are guilty of following ground beyond the boundaries of sense. Oh. A similar mistake has been made in connection with such properties as unicorns are fictitious. Here again, the fact that there is a superficial grammatical resemblance between the English sentences dogs are faithful and unicorns are fictitious, and between the corresponding sentences in other languages creates the assumption that they are of the same logical type. Dogs must exist in order to have the property of being faithful. And so it is held that unless unicorns in some way existed, they could not have the property of being fictitious. But, as it is plainly self contradictory to say that fictitious objects exist, the device is employed of saying that they are real in some non empirical sense, that they have a mode of real being which is different from the mode of being of existent things. But since there is no way of testing whether an object is real in this sense, as there is for testing whether it is real in the ordinary sense, the assertion that fictitious objects have a special non empirical mode of real being, is devoid of all literal significance. It comes to be made as a result of the assumption that being fictitious is an attribute. And this is a fallacy of the same order as the fallacy of supposing that existence is an attribute and it can be exposed in the same way. In general, the postulation of real non existent entities results from the superstition, just now referred to, that to every word or phrase that can be the grammatical subject of a sentence, there must somewhere be a real entity corresponding. Whereas there is no place in the empirical world for many of these entities, a special non empirical world is invoked to house them. This error must be attributed to only the utterances of a Heidegger, who bases his metaphysics on the assumption that nothing is a name which is used to denote something peculiarly mysterious, but also the prevalence of such problems as those concerning the reality of propositions and universals, whose senselessness, though complete. These few examples afford a sufficient indication of the way in which most metaphysical assertions come to be formulated. They show how easy it is to write sentences which are literally nonsensical without seeing that they are nonsensical. And thus, we see that the view that a number of the traditional problems of philosophy are metaphysical and consequently fictitious does not involve any incredible assumptions about the psychology of philosophers. Among those who recognize that if philosophy is to be accounted a genuine branch of knowledge, it must be defined in such a way as to distinguish it from metaphysics, it is fashionable to speak of the metaphysician as a kind of misplaced poet. As his statements have no literal meaning, they are not subject to any criteria of truth or falsehood. But they may still serve to express or arouse emotion, must be subject to ethical or aesthetic standards. And it is suggested that they may have considerable value as means of moral inspiration, or even as works of art. In this way, an attempt is made to compensate the metaphysician for his extrusion from philosophy. I'm afraid with his deserts. The view that the metaphysician is to be reckoned among the poets appears to rest on the assumption that both talk nonsense. But this assumption is false. In the vast majority of cases, the sentences which are produced by poets do have literal meaning. The difference between the man who uses language scientifically and the man who uses it emotively is not that one produces sentences which are incapable of arousing emotion, and the other sentences which have no sense, but that one is concerned with the expression of true propositions, the other with the creation of a work of art. Thus, if a work of science contains true and important propositions, its value as a work of science will hardly be diminished by the fact that they were inelegantly expressed. And similarly, the work of art is not necessarily the worse for the fact that all the propositions comprising it are literally false. But to say that many literary works are largely composed of falsehoods is not to say that they are composed of pseudo propositions. It is, in fact, very rare for a literary artist to produce sentences which have no literal meaning. And where this does occur, the sentences are carefully chosen for their rhythm and balance. If the author writes nonsense, it is because he considers it most suitable for bringing about the effects for which his writing is designed. The metaphysician, on the other hand, does not intend to write nonsense. He laughs us into it through being deceived by grammar or through committing errors of reasoning, such as that which leads to the view that the sensible world is unreal. But it is not the mark of a poet simply to make mistakes of this sort. There are some, indeed, who would see, in fact, that the metaphysician's utterances are senseless, a reason against the view that they have aesthetic value. And without going so far as this, we may safely say that it does not constitute a reason for it. It is true, however, that although the greater part of metaphysics is merely an embodiment of humdrum errors, there remain a number of metaphysical passages which are the work of genuine mystical feeling, and they may more plausibly be held to have moral or aesthetic value. But as far as we are concerned, the distinction between the kind of metaphysics that is produced by a philosopher who has been duped by grammar and the kind that is produced by a mystic who is trying to express the inexpressible is of no great importance. What is important to us is to realize that even the utterances of the metaphysician who is attempting to expound a vision are literally senseless, so that henceforth we may pursue our philosophical researches with as little regard for them as for the more inglorious kind of metaphysics which comes from a failure to understand the workings of our language. Oh,